In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. Today, we are going to talk about federal debt. And the reason why this has come up is that we just passed the debt ceiling. And so before we begin, if you're okay with it, Colin, I'm going to go through just a brief, informational segment about the federal debt. And I think sometimes first step is that, the obvious one, the debt just means that the government is spending more money than it's bringing in. Of course, it brings money in terms of taxes, and it's spending more than it's earning. Uh, and
Well, Brian,
yeah,
we should call that the deficit, right? The deficit is that they're spending more than they're bringing in. The debt is the accumulation of years of deficit
great point.
or
Yes, you're
period of
absolutely
time of
right.
deficit.
Yes, you're right. The deficit, and that's often it's often a point that's confused is the deficit and the debt, which I just did. I was illustrating the confusion that can often happen between the two.
Nice job.
Thank you. I always seek out the teaching moments. And it often happens that way where you'll hear in the news, oh, the deficit has actually turned, and so things are looking better right now. And there's moments where that happens, but it's also important to recognize that simply because there's a period of deficit reduction doesn't mean there's debt reduction. You have to have a significant amount of time where there's more income coming in than money that's being spent in order to have a reduction in the debt. And so back in 1917, a debt ceiling was implemented where there was going to be a cap on the amount of debt the government could carry. But then, of course, you have the Congress has the ability to raise that debt ceiling when it's necessary. And they've done so frequently since that time. And it's been a pretty consistent practice to raise that ceiling. In fact, every president since Herbert Hoover has raised the debt ceiling at least once in their presidential term, and some of them have raised it multiple times. Anything on that brief going over that you want to add to or clarify?
Nope, I think that pretty well explains it.
Okay. And so then we have the debt ceiling that we just surpassed. Janet Yellen, who is the Treasury Secretary, I believe, went to Congress and said, this has happened, and y'all need to do something about it. She has the ability to take extraordinary measures, emergency measures, in order to manage the fact that we have essentially run out of income to pay some of our debts. But if the debt ceiling is not addressed quickly, we will run the risk of not paying on our obligations. And those obligations could be things like federal wages. It could be, which is bad, but of course that can be made up for later on. Where it's really bad, where it can really impact the reputation of the government and the ability to pay our debts, is if we default on any of our payments on our larger obligations, especially when those obligations are held by foreign countries. For example, our treasury bonds. That about right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so let's start the conversation. What are your, Mr. Libertarian? What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, obviously, I think we spend too much. Um, and I would prefer that I think oftentimes we get into discussions about, I think far too often we get in discussions about how are we going to pay for all this, and people are talking about taxes, but we spend so little time talking about reductions in spending. And I think that's where the real uh, effort should be, is looking at how we can cut spending. And sometimes they'll even say something like, well, listen, if you're really serious about cutting the deficit, you need to talk about the huge entitlement programs because that's where all the money is. You won't save enough in other areas. but I would prefer to start in every aspect of federal spending to look for ways to spend less, to find waste. I think, even in our own lives, when you're just talking about your personal budget, from time to time, it's healthy to go through your own expenditures and look at how you can call the cable company and maybe get a cheaper plan. Get we'll see what options there are for cell phones, and money can be saved, in every aspect of our lives. And in something like the federal government, there's so much to be saved. I do have a fair amount of ideas as to where we could save some money. If you wanted to talk about that, I don't know exactly where you wanted this conversation to head.
Well, yeah, and first of all, with what you addressed in the very beginning about the taxes versus spending, one of the things I ran across in my short little bit of research was that when people talk about uh, bringing in more money through taxes, sometimes they mean we should bring in more money by cutting taxes, and sometimes they mean we should bring in more money by raising taxes. Now, it's obvious, people feel it's obvious if you're raising taxes, there should bring in more money. But then some people would argue that, well, when you raise taxes, you actually, you stifle growth. And so there's less income. And then the same thing happens with, the speculation about what will happen if we reduce taxes, about whether that'll raise some of the money that comes in, or lower the money which comes in. But whichever way it goes, I mean, there has been both that has happened in the past, where taxes have been raised and money has increased, taxes have raised and money has decreased, and the same thing with reduction of taxes. And it's always speculative as to whether changing the taxes will somehow change the income. But when you look at reducing costs, reducing your expenditures, that's pretty definitive, because you are deciding how much. It's sort of uncertain as to whether your income can increase or decrease, but it's fairly certain when you decide on cutting expenses what's going to happen. You're going to decrease your expenses. So it seemed like that's a more surefire way in which to address the issue. The other one is sort of guessing and hoping.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, and it was disappointing, it's been disappointing in recent years. Even Donald Trump, who talked about, how well he ran businesses and he was going to run government like a business, and then he, had his much touted tax cuts, but he cut the taxes and did nothing to cut spending. And surprisingly, when I looked into it, it seemed like he cut spending, or he requested a smaller increase than Congress actually gave him in government spending. So both Republicans and Democrats have been, I don't know if equally bad is the right term, but they've both been bad in the way that they've gone about spending. They both seem to be very liberal, shall we say, not in the political sense, but just liberal in their spending habits. And so, yeah, I already agree with you. It's difficult to figure out what tax revenues are going to do. I think we probably have some pretty um, personalized opinions as to what would happen were we to raise taxes or lower taxes in different ways. But what we do know is if you cut spending, yeah, you'll see a lot less of that. And I've got a lot of ideas. What are your thoughts about best ways to cut spending?
Well, the yeah. Before we go there was one other little thing that I wanted to talk about is that I think you brought up a really good point, which is it's fairly common for a budget to actually grow over what it's asked for. In fact, in this last budget, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, came out and said we need something like $700 billion for this next year for our money, and Congress said, yeah, you want that? Well, we're going to give you 800 billion. What are you going to do now? And this seems to be the sort of thing that they say we're not going to give you what you want. We're going to give you more than what you want. Take that,
Yeah,
you big military machinery complex. Excuse me.
military industrial complex.
That's the one. That's the one I was looking for. Yeah, it escaped me. I'm getting older. The and it's almost like a sign of patriotism. I think I don't know exactly. It's the only thing I can think of when they say, "Oh yeah, we're going to actually increase the defense spending." And one of the arguments I heard was, "Well, we now need to worry about China." And so we should be increasing our spending. But I wanted to show you. I found this chart that looks at the historic spending since mid 19th century, early 19th century. And in this chart, you can see you've got a pretty dramatic increase in the last 70 years or so. Oh, it did drop for a little bit in the 50s and 60s. And the chart, the yellow bands, is when there was a war. And it makes sense that there's going to be increase in war, because you can't tell your general, I want you to go, drive all the way to Berlin, or until you spend $10 billion, whichever one comes first. You have to have
Mhm.
your military goals, and you can't really put a financial cap on them, because it's going to hinder your ability to do what you're trying to do militarily. And so, if you allow for free spending of the military during those times, there should also be the belt tightening in the other times, which we're not seeing a whole lot of in the last 40, 50 years. And so, when people are saying, well, we've gotten out of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you would think this would be a time of deficit reduction or debt reduction. And they're actually, like we just heard in this last budget that went through, we got an increase in defense spending for that budget. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this, I don't want to say something too controversial that'll just cause you to disagree, but I think there's a tendency with when you're in a position like these politicians are, there's a real incentive. It seems like we could agree on this. There's a real incentive to prove that you're doing something.
Yeah,
You don't get you don't get a lot of reward or votes, or I guess new votes typically if you say, well, I didn't do much. I just kind of sat on my hands. When there is a perceived fear, sometimes the politicians, I think, are even going to be incentivized to make that fear seem worse than it is, because then they can prove how they're protecting us, what the good that they're doing for us. This is the real danger of government, is anybody that has a vested interest in that power is going to be motivated by seeing their politicians do something,
yeah,
so yeah, I think I totally agree. Even in the times when there's a chance to cut back and to do less, that's not what they do. They just do more. I was looking a little bit at some of the spending. There's 750 military bases around the world today outside of the U.S. and 179,000 troops. 54,000 in Japan, 34,000 in Germany, 26,000 in Korea. There are 731 soldiers in Cuba. I mean, how did we make that happen?
yeah, yeah. Is that
It's just
Guantanamo Bay?
maybe, I guess. Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's probably a good point. But like in a place that is not an ally of ours, we
Yeah,
somehow have found a way to get 730 troops. It's pretty amazing. And so all this money is out there, and people are feeling like, well, there's not a huge incentive for them to cut back, because if they cut back on the spending and something goes wrong, or they cut back on the troop deployments or anything like that and something goes wrong, well, it was on your watch that you didn't keep us safe. You should have kept, why did you cut the funding? They are incentivized to have those troops out there, to have more bases, because then you can't be criticized if something goes wrong. Well, geez, we had all the troops out there, we're spending the money. And so it just becomes a way to, all the incentive is to have more troops out there, and none of the incentive is to take the troops back, unless you're Rand Paul, I guess.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I think also that there's this idea that when you come back up for re-election in 4 years or 6 years or whenever it happens, you're going to go before your constituents and say, look at this list of things I've done for you. And you need to be able to show them these immediate benefits. If you were to go forward to them and say, I've put together a plan and you're going to benefit in 40 years from now, it's a harder sell. And I think that's in part the politicians, but I also blame the American people, that they're not going to be so forward thinking as to, or they're going to be easily deluded when the opposition comes forward and say, oh, 40 years, he says it's going to change. Oh, but what about this year? What has he done for you right now? And so the American public has gotten accustomed to immediate improvements in some way or the other. And when you talk about a debt reduction plan that's going to take a couple decades, it's a harder sell. And so we're not I think that in part we're not pushing our politicians hard enough for that approach. I also ran across a little report about Canada, which was in had a near double-digit budget deficit in the 90s. And over 4 years, they had 20% budget cuts, pretty dramatic, and it had a pretty dramatic impact. And they were able to cut their public debt by 1/3 within 5 years. And they accomplished the
Amazing.
whole thing without raising taxes. Now, a lot of people will look at Canada and find a lot of fault with some of the policies they have in place. Like when people talk about the universal health care, they always point to Canada as the failure where it doesn't work. So I think that, but the fact that they were able to actually actively address a problem, I think does admire or does help us to find some admiration for them as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so you want to
Yeah.
go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was just saying about Canada. I had heard a similar option that could be tried in America, where if you brought the government together and said, listen, we're going to have a 10% spending cut across the board. I mean, no exceptions. We're going to cut 10%. And I guess you could say, well, if we don't want to cut one area, we have to cut if we don't want to cut one area at all, we have to cut some other area 20% as long as it's an equal cut or an equal change.
Sure.
But 10% across the board, and then for the next 4 years, say, in spite of inflation, we're not going to increase spending at all. If the budgets are what they are, if we want to make any changes to the budget, something has to come out before something goes in. I mean, after 4 years, after 5 years, you'd have, and this was before, I guess, the 6 trillion or whatever it was that we spent after COVID. But so who knows what it would take now? But something as small as that, even when our debt was 20 trillion, and we had a massive, not quite as big of a deficit as we have now. But little things like that can make such a huge difference. All we have to do is stop the bleeding, and it could make a huge difference in what we're doing.
For sure. Yeah. Did you had some specific ideas? That was one, obviously, kind of across the board 10% cut. Do you have anything more specific?
Yeah, there's a number of things I would talk about. I would cut out government transfers to billionaires and millionaires. And examples of that I would give would be farm subsidies, because most of these farm subsidies go to huge operations with very wealthy people. I know that Boeing has received $13 billion in subsidies by one measure. I looked up that GM had received $3.5 billion in 1 year. Royal Dutch Shell, $2 billion. So really looking at subsidies that are given, especially to these large corporations, I would do away with those completely.
Now, just to get a little clarification there, I mean, some of these subsidies are not someone saying, "Here, I want to give Royal Dutch Shell some money." It's usually based on something that they feel like maybe the government or the country is benefiting, and so they're giving them some sort of tax cut. Or am I misunderstanding?
I think those were just straight transfers, grants, and things like that. I mean, and if it is a tax cut, I would say the same thing. Why are they receiving a tax cut that other businesses aren't receiving? But here we are, Royal Dutch Shell that I brought up, and then you kind of reiterated is a great example. Whatever subsidies they're getting, whatever transfers they're receiving, whatever tax cuts they're receiving, we're giving them this incentive to produce more. And then on the other hand, we're subsidizing, 30%. Well, for a long time, it was 30% federal tax incentive for solar installations. We have similar tax credits for wind. We have state and local incentives as well. We put tariffs on foreign solar panels coming into the country. So we're subsidizing the oil and gas industry while also subsidizing the renewable energy sector. So I would do away with all the tariffs. I would do away with all of the incentives, all of the tax cuts, do away with that completely.
Now, the farming, I could imagine there'd be a little bit of pushback on that one because although you mentioned some, big farming conglomerates and multinationals and millionaire farmers, there's also, the farmers have sort of a special place in America's heart. As we have this image that was, how a lot of the West was won of, the husband and wife and their kids going off in the wagons to go settle Oklahoma and Kansas, and growing their crops by hand. And I think a lot of people still have this idea that it happens. And I do think that there are a lot of small farms, and I'm not sure how we can both support the small farmer at the same time take away some of the free money for the big corporations.
Just out of curiosity, why would we support the small farmer more than we would support the small auto mechanic or the small shop owner or the small history teacher or the small marina operator, what have you? The small yoga instructors. Like, I don't understand that. I don't understand that at all. Why we would subsidize one part of the economy because somehow it makes us feel good that there's a good history there or something. It seems like we should let the market handle itself, and the market does a pretty good job of sorting that stuff out. And us just having a nice feeling about the way some people are making money as opposed to somebody else, I don't think that is a reason for subsidies.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know that there's also this image that we have of, that the American farm family is a dying breed, and that those that are still doing it are really struggling to be able to keep the family farm operational. I don't know how accurate that is. I just know that, so, one of these images is often brought up. But you do bring up a good point of the fact that why is one business subsidized and another business is not. Now, another argument that's often put forward is that by providing a bit of support for these farms, it's keeping the cost of food low for the American consumer. Um, I don't
Oh,
know if
that
you,
it's actually doing the opposite.
what do you mean?
Well, uh, if for example you have if you're subsidizing somebody, who's paying for that subsidization? It's the government that pays for it. And moreover, when you subsidize a less efficient operation and allow them to stay in business, then you don't reward those more efficient types of businesses. Just as an example, I know people have a problem with us getting our food from other sources, but if the sugar farmers just can't produce sugar here in America as efficiently for a number of reasons. Probably low cost of labor is going to be one of them, as other countries. But then we subsidize our local farmers or put tariffs on imported sugar. Well, then people are paying more for sugar than they otherwise would be. So you're raising prices. And who is that going to make the most difference to? It's not going to make a big difference to very wealthy people. People that it's really going to make a big difference to are going to be the poor people in our country that are trying to buy food that is more expensive.
So you're saying that because foreign food often has an extra tariff or tax put on it, it's raising the price of the food at the supermarket level. Is that correct?
Or, if somebody, for example, I mean, that's one possibility. I don't know how many tariffs there are on imported food products. I just think tariffs in general are a bad idea. But even the subsidization, if we subsidize food products here in America, then inefficient farm operations are able to still stay in business, even though their cost structures are high. So if they are able to compete when against if there's for example, somebody in Costa Rica, a poor farmer there, and trying to export his sugar to America or in Mexico, wherever it's coming from, and he can offer it a certain price. Well, that American producer couldn't offer it at that price, save for the subsidies that he's receiving from the federal government to allow him to be able to keep his higher cost structure. So it's costing us money, and prices don't come down as low as low as they should.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. There's some sense that I think that yeah, I mean that I don't no point in debating some of the nuances of it. I think it's a reasonable idea. Other ones? What else you got?
Other ones that I would talk about would be looking at Medicare and Social Security. One
Ooh.
thing that I noticed was Yeah, it's a tender topic for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think there's a few things that we could do. One, we could allow people to opt out right now. I don't feel comfortable phasing out Social Security for people who have paid into it for all or part of their lives. And my feeling is that the federal government needs to keep its obligations. So as much as I'd like to cut spending on Social Security, we certainly can't do it for people that are just retired or that are going to be retiring soon. Even for people that are in their 30s or 40s that have paid in for a while, whatever obligations we've made to them to this point, we need to meet those obligations because we just need to, that's what a government should do is meet its obligations. However, going forward, we could reduce a lot of these things. I mean, I think, as you and I have discussed before, Social Security and Medicare, uh, when they were instituted, I think that the average age where people died was below even 65, where the retirement age is now. So that could be raised for people coming into the program now, meaning people that are just beginning to pay in now and saying, listen, we will still have Social Security as an option for you, but you're not going to be able to retire until you're 70. You're not going to be able to receive payments until you're 75. You're going to be responsible for your own savings. We got some 401k options for you, IRAs for you that you can take advantage of, but we're not going to uh, we're going to push back that retirement date. And then we could even say to people that make it easier for them to opt out of Medicare if they chose. I think a lot of people try to opt out of Medicare now, but it's difficult to do. And if you do opt out of Medicare, sometimes they'll tell you, well, it's going to be hard to re-enroll later. And if they weren't taking advantage of Medicare when they're retiring because they have other good options, if we made it easier for them to opt out when they're 65 and say, listen, if you want it later, we'll let you get back in when you're 70 or whatever age you want. I know that one of the things you may push back on is if we removed some of those people from the program that are starting to pay in now, I think surprisingly, the government has kind of spent the money for those people that have already invested. So that could be difficult. But I think that would be a wise choice to start taking some of that money out of the program in general and then find other ways to fund the program because they are obviously not doing a good job of managing that money for us.
Well, I can't argue with that last sentence you just put out there. I was going to argue some other things, but the last one you said that's pretty much spot on. They've done a really poor job of managing those accounts. I think that if I don't want to turn the whole conversation into a debate about Social Security, about Medicare. I think it is worth considering. I'm a little bit reluctant to agree to the idea that we should start to remove payees because or payers because one of the things that when we talk about the debt in general, that we're trying to increase money coming in, decrease money going out. And if you're talking about immediately, or if one of the plans is to go and decrease money coming in, it seems like we're only addressing half the issue. And I think that we really need to look at, if anything, stabilizing the money coming in, but also definitely, I think you and I are in agreement that we need to decrease the money going out.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
I understand that that's a bit of a tough sell to say to people you don't have to pay in, but we need to stop the bleeding at some point because they're not doing a good job of managing it, and people need an option. Even if we said something like, "Well, listen, we'll raise the retirement age," and even said, "Listen, you can pay in if you want, or you can be on your own and invest your money however you see fit. And if you do, you won't have Social Security. We obviously still have welfare in this country, so people would be fine." But we could do away with that completely for some people.
I don't know that the aged have unlimited access to welfare, so I don't know that that would be a great solution. But uh, again, moving on to other aspects. One of the things that I discovered as I was looking into this is that there's the mandatory budget and the discretionary budget. And the mandatory budget is obligations that Congress has decided that we have to do every year, and that the only way to change that, the mandatory budget, is with a congressional act, and that's the Social Security, that's the Medicaid, and the Medicare. The discretionary budget is what is chosen every year, to most times increasing it. Seems to be the trend. Hypothetically, they could decrease it every year, and that includes the defense, health services, the VA, Homeland Security, energy, HUD, the State Department, and NASA. And some of those, people may decide that that we need to focus some of our acts, our cutting, on particular departments. And I don't know. I mean, it's easy to question what the value of NASA is, for example. Although some have said that a lot of the satellites that we have access to, the GPS and other things, are a direct result of NASA's work. I don't really want to debate all that stuff. It's kind of a minor issue, but the easiest way to address it is to say across the board, everybody cuts, let's say, like you say, 10%, and see where they're able to make their cuts happen. And yes, it would be difficult for a number of years, but I think that it's what I when I went to think about or look at it and trying to wrap my head around it, I tried to look at it and create the analogy of like a home budget. If you were to go sit your family down and say, this coming year, I've got a salary of $45,000, and we're projected to spend $55,000, and we're just going to go ahead and do that. And not only we're going to do it this year, but that's the same thing we've been doing for the last 5 years. I mean, who in their right mind would say, yes, let's go ahead and spend an extra 20% of our beyond what our income is, and say that we're okay and this is a good plan for us. I mean, it just doesn't seem to make any sense. And yet year after year, that's exactly what the government has done, is they've gone and they spent more that they've had. And you have a few people like your good friend over there, Rand Paul, who's consistently trying to cut things back. But it seems like the only time that the Republicans want to cut is when they're not really in a position to do so. And the Democrats never want to cut. They just keep on going. They just keep on spending. So it's a really weird situation where when the Republicans are in power, they don't want to cut the budget. They just want to talk about it and fight for it when they can't actually they're not in a position to do so. No.
I would agree 100% with that. I think that's a real problem with the Republicans. I mean, it's almost a surprise that well, I don't know which is more surprising, that the Democrats never talk about it, it's not too surprising that what the Republicans do, because they're just politicians. It's kind of what you would
Yeah.
expect from them.
Yeah.
But it's really shameful. And Trump talked about he talked about budget and being so good at managing this stuff. He'd run it like a business. And while he was in power, at least the first couple of years, if I remember correctly, he was in power and the Republicans controlled they controlled Congress, and there was no reduction. In fact, there were increases, massive increases to spending. And at a time when the economy was booming. I mean, the perfect time to cut it. There's no excuse for it. They were
Yeah.
horrible stewards of that money, of their responsibility. So yeah, I agree 100% with you.
And I think that phrasing you just gave is a really important one about being financial stewards. And this is where our government has really failed us, is that we've expected them year after year to behave reasonably and responsibly, not just in terms of the way they've treated our Social Security, like their own personal bank account to go and withdraw as they need, figuring and putting in a bunch of IOUs in place of it, but also in terms of having a decent business, where it's viable, where it's functional, and instead of pushing the responsibility to the next generation, or the next House or the next Congress to go and deal with the mess that someone else has made, and it's no one's deciding, no one's stepping up to address it. But I'm also going
Yeah.
to blame the American public for not taking their representatives to task to do something about it.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, one further thing, we talked about the military before. To me, it's a very clear example of what I often talk about, that government tends to create a problem and then come in and say that they're the ones, oh, look at this horrible problem that somehow was created and we need to solve it. Because we have gone out into the world. Our foreign policy over the last 70 years has been very intrusive to other places. And I can't say, especially because I'm not an expert or making the decisions myself, but I can't say it's never been necessary. But man, we have sure gone to a lot of places, invaded a lot of countries. I mean, take even Vietnam and Korea out of the mix, and we've got Grenada, Libya, Kosovo, Iraq twice. I mean, we are just going all, and not to mention just from time to time when we go into other places, like we killed bin Laden in another country. I don't even know if they were aware that we were going to do it. We shoot missiles into different countries. We put our troops all over the place. We are, and then we're surprised when the world is a little bit angry at us, or that they don't trust us, or that they're fighting us or sending terrorists against us. I mean, we are the reason that some of these dictators are in power. If you're King Jong-il or whichever one is in power now, or some of these Middle Eastern leaders, and you can point to the great Satan or this horrible country that is trying to take over our country. I'm just protecting you from the Americans. They can hold us up as the great antagonist or the great Satan. What a great tool for them. We have created our, oh, not to mention in Ukraine, where Russia was so nervous about a NATO expansion, and then we keep giving reasons that maybe Ukraine should come and be a part of us. We gave them a lot of reasons to be upset, and I think we often give a lot of ammunition to the opposing side, and then we have to step in with money or weapons or actual troops, and it's just atrocious. And I think that's what government typically does, is there's this trying to help, the problem gets worse, and they really have to help us. And how can they do anything but help us, if that makes any sense?
Mm-hmm. It does, yeah. And I think when we became the world's policeman, we elected ourselves the world's policeman. We took on a lot of that defense responsibility, and then of course that comes a financial responsibility. And so now we've gotten to this habit of spending the problem away, but of course the problem never goes away; it just gets bigger. We need to wrap this up because we just got a little bit of time left. But yeah, that was a very productive conversation. That was good. I like that one. So thank you for participating in that one, where we basically agreed with each other. And well, I think we also really didn't chase the points that we disagreed on. We stuck to the topic and just kind of followed where it went. So there probably was a fair amount of disagreement, but we stuck to the big issues, so that was fine. So thanks for that, and we'll talk soon about what the next topic of conversation will be.
Okay, sounds good, Brian.
Thanks, Colin.
Bye.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.